June 3, 2024, the day Venezuela didn't blink. Let me tell you about the moment that should have been front-page news but wasn't. On that Monday, Nicolas Maduro's government did something extraordinary, not because it was loud or violent, but because it was quiet. After months of escalating U.S. pressure, economic sanctions, and even thinly veiled threats of military action, Venezuela didn't back down. It didn't fold. It didn't beg for mercy. Instead, it did the one thing Washington least it waited. I've spent the last 3 decades studying crises like this, moments when great powers miscalculate, when brinkmanship backfires, when the world realizes that the rules of the game have changed. And what happened in June wasn't just another diplomatic spat. It was a turning point, a crack in the unipolar order, a sign that the old playbook no longer works. The mainstream media framed it as a minor setback for U.S. policy, a temporary hiccup in the broader campaign to restore democracy in Venezuela. But that's not what this was. This was a geopolitical earthquake in slow motion, and if we don't understand why Venezuela didn't blink, we won't understand the world that's coming. So let's start with the story they want you to believe. The official, a simple story of good versus evil. Here's how the U.S. government and its allies described the situation in the weeks leading up to June 3. Venezuela, under the authoritarian rule of Nicolas Maduro, was a failed state, a narco-dictatorship, in the words of Secretary of State Antony Blinken, that had plunged its people into poverty while enriching itself through corruption and drug trafficking. The U.S. had imposed crippling sanctions, frozen Venezuelan assets abroad, and even indicted Maduro on drug trafficking charges in 2020. The goal? To force a transition to democracy, ideally by pressuring the regime to hold free and fair elections. Then, in April 2024, something shifted. The Biden administration, facing rising gas prices ahead of the November election, quietly eased some sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector in exchange for Maduro's promise to hold competitive elections later that year. The deal was brokered with the help of Norway and Brazil, and for a moment, it seemed like Washington's strategy was working. Maduro allowed opposition candidates to register, released some political prisoners, and even hinted at a possible power-sharing arrangement. But then, just as the U.S. was celebrating what it called a diplomatic breakthrough, Maduro pulled the rug out from under them. On May 30, Venezuela's Supreme Court, stacked with regime loyalists, disqualified Maria Corina Machado, the opposition's most popular candidate, from running in the July election. The U.S. responded swiftly. On June 1, the Treasury Department reimposed sanctions on Venezuela's gold sector, and the State Department issued a stern Maduro has once again shown his true colors. The United States will not tolerate this blatant violation of democratic norms. The media ran with the narrative. The New York Times called it a setback for democracy, while the Washington Post warned that Maduro was testing Biden's resolve. Pundits on cable news debated whether the U.S. should tighten the screws further, with some hawks calling for a naval blockade or even targeted strikes against regime assets. The message was Maduro was a tyrant who had betrayed his people, and the U.S. had no choice but to double down on pressure. But here's the problem with this: it's not true. Not in the way they're telling it, at least. Oh, Maduro is certainly an authoritarian, no serious analyst disputes that. But the idea that this was a simple morality play, a battle between democracy and dictatorship, is a fantasy. The real story is far more complicated, and far more dangerous. To understand why Venezuela didn't blink, we have to peel back the layers of propaganda, miscalculation, and geopolitical chess that most commentators are missing. Deconstructing the what they're not telling you. Let's start with the facts that don't fit the official story. Fact number 1, the U.S. never had a real plan for Venezuela. For years, Washington has treated Venezuela like a problem to be solved with sanctions and threats, not a country with its own agency. The U.S. imposed sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector in 2019, hoping to starve the regime of revenue. But here's what they didn't account: Venezuela didn't collapse. Instead, it adapted. It deepened ties with Russia, China, and Iran, countries that don't care about U.S. sanctions. By 2023, Venezuela was exporting more oil than it had in years, just not to the US or Europe. It was selling to India, China, and even Syria, often at a discount, using a shadow fleet of tankers to evade detection. The data doesn't support the idea that sanctions were working. According to the IMF, Venezuela's GDP grew by 4% in 2023, the first year of positive growth since 2013. That's not a typo. Despite US sanctions, despite hyperinflation, despite mass emigration, the Venezuelan economy exited. How? Because Maduro's government found new markets and new allies. The US thought it could strangle Venezuela into submission, but all it did was push Caracas into the arms of America's rivals. Fact number 2, the democratic transition was always a mirage. The Biden administration's April 2024 deal with Maduro was never about democracy. It was about oil. With gas prices creeping up ahead of the US election, the White House needed Venezuela's crude to stabilize global markets. The deal was Maduro would allow some opposition participation in the election, and in return, the US would ease sanctions on Venezuela's oil exports. It was transactional, not transformational. But here's the Maduro never intended to lose. The disqualification of Maria Corina Machado wasn't a last-minute betrayal, it was the plan all along. Machado is a hardline anti-Chavista who has called for foreign intervention in Venezuela. Maduro knew she was unelectable in a fair contest, but he also knew that disqualifying her would give the US an excuse to reimpose sanctions. And that's exactly what happened. Why would Maduro want sanctions reimposed? Because it plays into his narrative. Every time the US tightens the screws, Maduro can point to Washington as the real enemy of Venezuela. It rallies his base, justifies crackdowns on dissent, and gives him cover to deepen ties with Russia and China. The US fell into a trap of its own making. Fact number 3, Venezuela has backing, and it's not just Russia. The mainstream media loves to frame Venezuela as a Russian puppet, but that's a gross oversimplification. Yes, Russia has been a key ally, sending military advisors, investing in Venezuela's oil sector, and even deploying nuclear-capable bombers to Caracas in 2018 as a show of force. But Venezuela's most important backer isn't Moscow. It's Beijing. China has poured billions into Venezuela over the last 2 decades, much of it in the form of loans for oil deals. When US sanctions hit, China didn't flinch. It continued buying Venezuelan oil, often at below market prices, and even helped Caracas evade sanctions by using middlemen in Malaysia and the UAE. In 2023, China imported nearly 400,000 barrels of Venezuelan oil per day, more than any other country. But here's the part they don't tell: China isn't just propping up Maduro out of the goodness of its heart. It's playing the long game. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, even bigger than Saudi Arabia's. And China, which imports more oil than any other country, wants a piece of that. If the US ever succeeds in toppling Maduro, the next government in Caracas will almost certainly be pro-Western. That means US and European oil commies will get first dibs on Venezuela's reserves. China can't allow that. So when the US reimposed sanctions in June, China didn't just shrug. It doubled down. In the weeks that followed, Chinese state-owned banks reportedly increased their exposure to Venezuelan debt, and Beijing quietly signaled that it would continue buying oil regardless of US pressure. That's not just economic support, that's a geopolitical lifeline. Fact number 4, the US military option was never credible. Let's talk about the elephant in the idea that the US could just invade Venezuela and fix things. Every few months, some think tank or retired general publishes an op-ed arguing that a limited military intervention could topple Maduro quickly and painlessly. The logic goes something like: Venezuela's military is weak, its people are desperate, and a few precision strikes on regime targets would force Maduro to flee. This is dangerously naive. First, Venezuela's military may not be the most advanced in the world, but it's not Iraq in 2003. It has Russian-made S-300 air defense systems, which could shoot down US aircraft. It has thousands of paramilitary forces loyal to the regime. And it has the backing of Russia and Iran, both of which have warned that any US intervention would trigger a response. Second, even if the US could take out Maduro quickly, what then? Venezuela is a country of 28 million people, with deep political divisions and a history of violent resistance to foreign intervention. The US would inherit a failed state, not a democracy. We've seen this movie before: Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and it never ends well. Third, and most importantly, the US doesn't have the bandwidth for another war. The Pentagon is already stretched thin by Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East. Adding Venezuela to the list would be a strategic disaster. The Biden administration knows this, which is why it has ruled out military action, at least for now. But here's the Maduro knows it too. That's why he didn't blink. He knows the US can invade, and he knows that sanctions alone won't break his regime. So he's calling Washington's bluff. The bigger Venezuela as a proxy battlefield. Now, let's out. What's really happening in Venezuela isn't about democracy or human rights. It's about power. It's about the slow-motion collapse of the US-led unipolar order and the rise of a new multipolar world. And Venezuela is just one front in that struggle. The US, clinging to hegemony. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption that it can shape the world in its image. The end of the Cold War was supposed to be the end of history, a moment when liberal democracy and free markets would spread across the globe. But that's not how things turned out. Instead, we've seen the rise of authoritarian capitalism, the resurgence of great power competition, and the fragmentation of the international order. Venezuela is a microcosm of this broader struggle. The US sees Maduro as a threat not because he's a dictator. If that were the standard, Washington would have invaded Saudi Arabia decades ago, but because he's defiant. He's thumbing his nose at the US and getting away with it. And in a world where America's word no longer carries the weight it once did, that's dangerous. The Biden administration's Venezuela policy is a case study in strategic incoherence. On one hand, it wants to pressure Maduro into holding fair elections. On the other, it needs Venezuelan oil to keep gas prices low ahead of the election. It talks about democracy but cuts deals with dictators. It imposes sanctions but then lifts them when it's politically convenient. The result? A policy that pleases no one and achieves nothing. The spoiler. Russia's involvement in Venezuela is often framed as a way to poke the US in the eye, and that's not wrong. But it's also about the preservation of a multipolar world. For Russia, Venezuela is a beachhead in America's backyard, a way to tie down US resources and distract Washington from other theaters, like Ukraine. In 2019, when the US recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president, Russia doubled down on its support for Maduro. It sent military advisors, Wagner Group mercenaries, and even nuclear-capable bombers to Caracas. The message was, if you mess with Venezuela, you mess with us. But Russia's support isn't unlimited. Moscow is bogged down in Ukraine, and its economy is under severe strain. It can't prop up Maduro indefinitely. That's why Russia has been pushing for a negotiated solution, one that keeps Maduro in power but gives the US just enough to save face. The problem? Neither side is willing to compromise. The long game. China's approach to Venezuela is the opposite of Russia's. Where Moscow is loud and confrontational, Beijing is quiet and patient. China doesn't care about ideology. It cares about resources, markets, and influence. And Venezuela has all three. China's strategy is keep Maduro in power, keep buying Venezuelan oil, and keep extending its economic footprint. It's not trying to replace the US in Venezuela, it's trying to outlast it. And so far, it's working. The US can impose sanctions, but China has the world's largest economy and a voracious appetite for oil. It can wait. And as long as China is willing to buy Venezuelan crude, Maduro doesn't need the US or Europe. The regional Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. The US isn't the only player in Latin America, and its neighbors don't always see eye to eye with Washington. Brazil's Lula da Silva has been a vocal critic of US sanctions on Venezuela, arguing that they hurt ordinary people more than the regime. Colombia's Gustavo Petro, the country's first leftist president, has called for dialogue with Maduro. And Mexico's Andrés Manuel López Obrador has refused to recognize Guaidó, instead pursuing a policy of non-intervention. This regional divide is a problem for the US. If Latin America's biggest democracies won't back Washington's Venezuela policy, it undermines the moral case for intervention. And it gives Maduro cover to claim that he's not isolated, that he has friends in the region. Military-wide war is a fantasy. Let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where the hawks in Washington are dangerously wrong. The idea that the US could invade Venezuela and liberate the country in a matter of weeks is a fantasy. Here's 1. Venezuela's military isn't Iraq's military. In 2003, the US invaded Iraq with a force of 145,000 troops. The Iraqi military, demoralized and poorly equipped, collapsed within weeks. Venezuela's military is different. It's battle-hardened from years of counterinsurgency operations against Colombian guerrillas. It has Russian and Chinese equipment, including advanced air defense systems. And it has a paramilitary force, the colectivos, that could wage a brutal insurgency against any occupying force. 2. The logistics nightmare. Venezuela is a vast country with dense jungles, towering mountains, and sprawling cities. The US would need hundreds of thousands of troops to secure it, more than it deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan combined. And even then, it would face a determined resistance. The US learned in Iraq that occupying a country is far harder than invading it. Venezuela would be no different. 3. The Russian and Iranian wildcards. Russia has already warned that any US intervention in Venezuela would trigger a response. What does that mean? It could mean cyber attacks on US infrastructure. It could mean increased support for Iran's proxies in the Middle East. It could even mean direct military action in another theater, like Syria or Ukraine. Iran, meanwhile, has been a key ally of Venezuela for years. It has sent oil tankers to break the US blockade, and it has provided military advisors. If the US invaded, Iran could retaliate by targeting US forces in Iraq or the Persian Gulf. 4. The domestic political fallout. The American public is war-weary. After Iraq and Afghanistan, there's little appetite for another foreign adventure. A Venezuela war would be deeply unpopular, especially if it dragged on for years. And with the 2024 election looming, Biden can't afford another foreign policy disaster. 5. The strategic distraction. The US is already overstretched. It's supporting Ukraine against Russia, deterring China over Taiwan, and managing crises in the Middle East. Adding Venezuela to the list would be a strategic blunder. It would divert resources from higher priority theaters and play into China's hands. So no, the US isn't going to invade Venezuela. But the fact that some people in Washington are still talking about it shows how detached from reality they are. The domestic why Biden can't walk away. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the Oval, the 2024 election. Biden's Venezuela policy isn't just about geopolitics. It's about politics, plain and simple. And the political calculus is messy. 1. The Florida factor. Florida is a must-win state for Biden, and it's home to a large Venezuelan exile community that despises Maduro. These voters are a key part of the Democratic coalition, and they're furious about the administration's perceived softening on Venezuela. When Biden eased sanctions in April, Florida Democrats warned that it would cost him votes. When Maduro disqualified Machado in May, those same voters demanded action. Biden's response? Reimpose sanctions and issue tough statements. But here's the it's not working. Maduro isn't backing down, and Florida's Venezuelan voters aren't satisfied. They want regime change, not half measures. And if Biden can't deliver, they'll stay home in November, or worse, vote for Trump. 2. The gas price dilemma. Biden's approval ratings are underwater, and inflation is a major reason. Gas prices, in particular, are a political albatross. The administration eased sanctions on Venezuela in April in part to bring more oil to market and lower prices. But when Maduro reneged on the deal, the White House had to reimpose sanctions, which could push gas prices back up. It's a no-win situation. If Biden keeps sanctions in place, he's blamed for high gas prices. If he lifts them again, he's accused of appeasing a dictator. Either way, the political damage is done. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about 2024. The Venezuela issue is a microcosm of a much larger problem in U.S. foreign policy, one that's been building for decades. We become addicted to the idea that we can shape the world through sanctions, threats, and occasional military interventions, but we've lost the ability to ask a simple what actually works? Let me explain why this matters beyond the election. Venezuela isn't just a political headache for Biden, it's a case study in the limits of American power. For years, we've treated Venezuela like a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be managed. The result? A policy that swings between maximalist demands, regime change, democracy now, and desperate half-measures, like easing sanctions in exchange for empty promises from Maduro. Here's the uncomfortable: the US has no good options in Venezuela because we've backed ourselves into a corner. We've spent 2 decades trying to isolate Maduro, but instead of collapsing, his regime has adapted. It's found new patrons in China, Russia, and Iran. It's learned to survive on a diet of sanctions evasion, black market oil sales, and gold smuggling. And most importantly, it's learned that the US isn't willing to go to war over Caracas. That last point is crucial. When I talk to military planners, they're clear-eyed about the risks of a Venezuela intervention. The Pentagon has wargamed this scenario, and the results aren't pretty. Venezuela isn't Grenada in 1983, a small island where a quick US operation could topple a regime and declare victory. It's a country of 28 million people, with a military that's been trained by Russia and equipped with advanced air defenses. The terrain is rugged, the population is divided, and the opposition is fractured. Even if the US could quickly seize Caracas, what comes next? A prolonged insurgency? A humanitarian catastrophe? Another Iraq? Let's be: the US military is already stretched thin. The Army is struggling to meet recruitment goals. The Navy is dealing with maintenance backlogs and a shrinking fleet. The Air Force is facing pilot shortages. And that's before we even consider the logistical nightmare of projecting power into South America. The last time the US tried a major amphibious operation was Inchon in 1950, and that was under far more favorable conditions. Today, the US would have to contend with Russian-made S-300 air defense systems, Chinese drones, and Iranian-backed militias, all while trying to avoid a wider regional conflict. And that's just the military side. The geopolitical fallout would be even worse. A US invasion of Venezuela would instantly unite Latin America against Washington. Even governments that dislike Maduro, like Brazil's Lula or Colombia's Petro, would condemn it as imperialism. Mexico would likely break diplomatic ties. The OAS would fracture. And China and Russia would seize the opportunity to extend their influence in the hemisphere, offering military aid, economic lifelines, and diplomatic cover to any government willing to stand up to the US. Here's another angle: most analysts: Venezuela isn't just a problem for the US. It's a problem for the entire Western Hemisphere. The country's collapse has sent millions of migrants flooding into Colombia, Brazil, Peru, and the US. It's destabilized regional economies and fueled transnational crime. And yet, the US has failed to build a coherent regional strategy to address it. Instead, we've relied on unilateral sanctions and occasional saber-rattling, which only pushes Venezuela closer to our adversaries. Take the recent military exercises. In July, Russia sent two Tu-160 strategic bombers to Venezuela for joint drills. In August, Iran announced it was sending warships to the Caribbean. These aren't just symbolic gestures. They're signals that Venezuela is becoming a forward operating base for America's rivals. And the more the US threatens military action, the more Maduro has an incentive to deepen those ties. So what's the alternative? The answer isn't more sanctions or more threats. It's a cold, hard reckoning with reality. The US needs to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere in the short term, and that regime change, if it happens, will be a long, messy process driven by Venezuelans, not Washington. That doesn't mean giving up on democracy or human rights. It means shifting from a policy of isolation to one of containment and engagement. For example, the US could work with regional partners to create a contact group that includes both Maduro and the opposition, with the goal of negotiating a gradual transition. It could offer sanctions relief in exchange for concrete steps toward free elections, rather than vague promises. And it could invest in rebuilding Venezuela's oil infrastructure, not to enrich Maduro, but to stabilize the country's economy and reduce migration pressures. But here's the: none of this will happen as long as US policy is driven by short-term political calculations. The Florida factor, the gas price dilemma, the 2024 election, these are all real constraints, but they're also excuses for avoiding the hard work of diplomacy. And until Washington stops treating Venezuela as a political football, we'll keep lurching from crisis to crisis, with no end in sight. The lesson of Venezuela isn't just about one country. It's about the limits of American power in an era of multipolar competition. The US can't afford to keep treating every global problem as a test of its resolve. Sometimes, the smartest move is to step back, reassess, and focus on what's achievable. But in Washington, that kind of pragmatism is in short supply. And that's why, for all the tough talk, Venezuela didn't blink. Because in the end, Maduro knows something that many in Washington still refuse to: the US can't force the outcome at once. It can only manage the consequences. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro didn't blink because he understands something fundamental about the domestic chessboard that Washington keeps misreading. The Venezuelan regime isn't a monolith, and its survival isn't just about Russian guns or Chinese loans. It's about a carefully constructed political ecosystem that has, against all odds, outmaneuvered both internal and external pressure for over a decade. And if we're going to talk about what comes next, we need to stop treating Venezuela as a geopolitical abstraction and start looking at the real levers of power inside the country. Let me explain why this matters. Most analyses of Venezuela's crisis focus on the obvious: the hyperinflation, the mass exodus, the oil collapse. But what they miss is how the regime has weaponized those very crises to consolidate control. Take the 2018 presidential election, widely dismissed as a sham. The opposition boycotted, turnout was abysmal, and Maduro won with 67% of the vote. The US and its allies declared it illegitimate, imposed more sanctions, and doubled down on Juan Guaidó as the interim president. But here's what most people don't: that election wasn't just about Maduro securing another term. It was about testing the opposition's ability to mobilize, measuring the international community's tolerance for fraud, and most importantly, gauging how much the Venezuelan public was willing to endure. The result? The regime learned that even in the depths of economic collapse, it could still outlast its domestic rivals. Now, fast forward to 2023. The opposition is fractured, Guaidó's political capital has evaporated, and the regime has successfully co-opted or crushed the most viable alternatives. The primary elections held last October, which the opposition hoped would unify its ranks behind a single candidate, were a masterclass in regime interference. The government-controlled Electoral Council delayed results, disqualified front-runners like Maria Corina Machado, and even arrested some of her campaign staff. Machado still won in a landslide, but the message was the regime will allow opposition participation only on its terms. And those terms are non-negotiable: no real threat to its power, no meaningful reforms, and certainly no path to a transition. This brings us to the most critical domestic: the military's role. The Venezuelan armed forces are not just a tool of repression, they are the backbone of the regime's economic survival. Since Chávez's early days, the military has been embedded in every sector of the economy: oil, mining, food distribution, even banking. The National Guard controls the border with Colombia, where smuggling and contraband generate billions in off-the-books revenue. The generals don't just follow orders, they profit from the status quo. And that's why, despite periodic purges and defections, the high command has remained loyal. The alternative, siding with the opposition, would mean losing their economic fiefdoms, and possibly facing prosecution for corruption or human rights abuses. Now, what most people don't ask: what happens if the military does fracture? The last time we saw serious cracks was in 2019, when Guaidó and the US tried to engineer a split by offering amnesty to military officers who defected. It failed spectacularly. The regime responded with a wave of arrests, and the few high-ranking defectors, like General Christopher Figuera, the former head of the intelligence service, were quickly sidelined. The lesson? The military's loyalty isn't just about ideology or fear. It's about a shared interest in preserving the system that keeps them rich and powerful. And that system is far more resilient than Washington wants to admit. So where does this leave us? The most likely scenario in the short to medium term is what I call managed decay. The regime will continue to allow just enough opposition activity to maintain the veneer of legitimacy, while ensuring that no real challenger emerges. It will make cosmetic concessions like releasing a handful of political prisoners or allowing limited humanitarian aid to keep the international community at bay. And it will rely on its allies Russia, China, Iran, and now even Turkey to provide enough economic oxygen to prevent total collapse. The goal isn't to fix Venezuela. It's to keep the regime in power, even if the country continues to rot. But here's this strategy has a shelf life. The longer the crisis drags on, the more the regime's support base erodes. The poor, who once formed Chavez's core constituency, are now the ones fleeing the country in record numbers. The middle class has been decimated. Even the military's loyalty isn't infinite, especially if the economic pie keeps shrinking. The question isn't whether the regime will face a reckoning. It's when, and under what conditions. Now, let's talk about the wildcards. The first is the 2024 U.S. election. If Trump returns to the White House, we could see a return to the maximum pressure playbook, more sanctions, more threats, and possibly even covert action. But as we've seen, that approach only strengthens Maduro's hand. A second Trump term might also embolden the most hardline elements of the Venezuelan opposition, who still believe that regime change is just one more push away. That's a dangerous gamble, because it could trigger a new cycle of repression and instability. The second wildcard is the opposition itself. Maria Corina Machado's victory in the primaries was a rare moment of unity, but the regime has already made it clear she won't be allowed to run. If the opposition can't find a way to navigate these obstacles either by rallying behind a substitute candidate or by mobilizing mass protests, it risks fading into irrelevance. And that would leave Venezuela with no viable alternative to Maduro, just a perpetually broken system. The third wildcard is oil. Venezuela's production has collapsed from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to just 700,000 today. But the country still sits on the world's largest proven reserves. If the regime can secure enough investment from China, Russia, or even Western firms willing to defy U.S. sanctions, it could stabilize its finances and buy itself more time. The Biden administration's recent decision to ease some sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector was a tacit admission that the old approach wasn't working. But it was also a gamble. If Maduro doesn't deliver on his promises, like allowing free elections in 2024, the U.S. could snap those sanctions back, plunging Venezuela into even deeper chaos. Here's the bottom: Venezuela's crisis isn't just a policy failure. It's a failure of imagination. For too long, the U.S. and its allies have treated Venezuela as a problem to be solved, rather than a reality to be managed. The regime isn't going to collapse under the weight of sanctions. The opposition isn't going to magically unite and overthrow Maduro. And the Venezuelan people aren't going to rise up in a revolution that somehow ends differently than the Arab Spring. The only way forward is a long, messy process of negotiation, one that acknowledges the regime's staying power while pushing for incremental reforms. But that requires something that's in short supply and patience. And until the U.S. stops treating Venezuela as a political football, we'll keep seeing the same cycle: sanctions, threats, and empty rhetoric while the country burns. Maduro didn't blink because he doesn't have to. And until we accept that, we'll keep losing. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the broader collapse of the post-Cold War order in Latin America. The U.S. has spent decades operating under the assumption that economic pressure and diplomatic isolation would eventually force regimes like Maduro's to capitulate. But that playbook was written in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union was gone, China was still a developing economy, and the U.S. had unchallenged leverage. Today, Venezuela isn't just resisting American pressure, it's actively exploiting the fractures in the global system. And that's a lesson Washington still hasn't learned. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. The Biden administration's decision to ease sanctions in October 2023 wasn't just about Venezuela, it was a signal to the rest of the global South. The message was: if you're willing to play ball on energy, migration, or even just basic diplomatic engagement, the U.S. will meet you halfway, even if you're an authoritarian regime. That's a radical departure from the Trump-era maximum pressure doctrine, and it reflects a grim reality: America's toolkit for dealing with rogue states is shrinking. Sanctions don't work when the target can pivot to China, Russia, or Iran for trade, financing, and military support. And when the US is simultaneously trying to contain Russia in Ukraine, manage tensions with China over Taiwan, and stabilize the Middle East, it can't afford another protracted crisis in its own backyard. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela isn't a problem to be solved, it's a condition to be managed. And the only way to manage it is through a grand strategy that accepts three hard truths. First, Maduro isn't going anywhere. The regime has survived hyperinflation, mass protests, a US-backed coup attempt in 2019, and even the recognition of Juan Guaido as interim president by over 50 countries. If that didn't break them, nothing will. Second, the opposition is fractured because the regime has spent 2 decades systematically dismantling its institutional power. The 2015 parliamentary elections, where the opposition won a supermajority, were the last time they had real leverage, and Maduro responded by creating a parallel legislature, the Constituent Assembly, to neutralize them. Third, the Venezuelan people are exhausted. The exodus of over 7 million refugees, nearly a quarter of the population, hasn't sparked a revolution, it's relieved pressure on the regime by exporting dissent. That's not a sign of strength, it's a sign of a society that's given up on change from within. So what are the alternatives? The first is the status quo: sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and occasional half-hearted negotiations that go nowhere. That's the path we've been on for years, and it's led to exactly one: Venezuela's economy is smaller than it was in 1950, but Maduro is still in power. The second is a full-throttle regime change strategy, which would require either a US military intervention or a massive, sustained effort to arm and fund the opposition. Neither is politically feasible. The American public has no appetite for another war, and the opposition is too divided to be an effective proxy. The third option, and the only one with a chance of working, is a long-term containment strategy that combines targeted sanctions, diplomatic engagement, and economic incentives to nudge the regime toward gradual reform. But here's that strategy only works if the US is willing to accept that Maduro isn't the only problem. The deeper issue is that Venezuela's political system is fundamentally broken. The 1999 Constitution, drafted under Chavez, was designed to centralize power in the executive and eliminate checks and balances. The judiciary, the electoral council, and even the military are all extensions of the regime. Any negotiation that doesn't address those structural flaws is just kicking the can down the road. And that's why the 2024 elections, if they happen, won't change anything. Even if Maria Corina Machado or another opposition candidate somehow wins, the regime will find a way to invalidate the results, just as it did in 2018 when it barred Enrique Capriles from running. Let me put this in historical perspective. The last time the US successfully engineered a democratic transition in Latin America was in Chile in 1989, when Augusto Pinochet stepped down after losing a referendum. But that only happened because Pinochet had lost the support of the military and the business elite. Maduro, by contrast, has spent the last decade purging the military of dissenters and co-opting the business class through corruption. The regime's survival isn't just about ideology, it's about control. And that control is reinforced by a global system that's no longer dominated by the US. China has become Venezuela's largest creditor, Russia has supplied weapons and intelligence, and Iran has helped prop up the oil sector. In a multipolar world, Maduro doesn't need to blink because he doesn't need to rely on the US anymore. So where does that leave us? The most likely scenario is a slow-motion collapse: Venezuela as a failed state, but one that never quite fails enough to trigger a real intervention. The economy will limp along, the regime will survive, and the opposition will keep fracturing. The US will oscillate between sanctions and engagement, depending on who's in the White House. And the Venezuelan people will keep leaving, turning the country into a hollowed-out shell of what it once was. That's not a prediction, it's an observation. Because the alternative, a negotiated transition to democracy, would require something that's in short supply in Washington, Caracas, and even among the humility. Humility to accept that the US can't fix Venezuela. Humility to admit that the opposition isn't ready to govern. And humility to recognize that Maduro, for all his flaws, has outmaneuvered every adversary thrown at him. That doesn't mean the US should give up. It means the US should stop pretending that there's a quick fix. The only way forward is a patient, incremental strategy that chips away at the regime's power without expecting it to collapse. That means targeted sanctions on human rights abusers, not blanket economic warfare. It means engaging with the regime on issues like migration and energy, but holding firm on democratic reforms. And it means supporting the opposition not as a tool for regime change, but as a long-term partner in rebuilding Venezuela's institutions. But here's the final, uncomfortable: even that might not be enough. Because Venezuela's crisis isn't just about politics or economics. It's about a society that's lost faith in the idea that things can get better. And no amount of foreign pressure or diplomatic engagement can fix that. The only people who can save Venezuela are Venezuelans. But after 2 decades of Chavismo, they're running out of reasons to believe that change is possible. And until that changes, Maduro won't blink, because he doesn't have to.